that's what you are. Unforgettable, though near or far, like a song of love that clings to me. How the thought of you does things to me. Never before has someone been more.
Peters Township is a community rich in history. Over the past 100 years, it has grown and expanded to become a thriving community. From a rural farm community, it has grown into a thriving suburb. Although much of the information of Peters Township's history can be found in textbooks, nothing can compare to a first-hand account of this information. Peters Township is lucky to have a resident who has witnessed much of this history. Her name is Esther Baird, and she has been a resident here in the township for over 80 years. I'm Heather Morgan, and today Heather Handyside and I will have a chance to speak with Miss Baird. Can you tell us when your family first moved into the township?
Oh, my family first moved into this township about 1893.
Okay, and what would Peters Township have looked like during that time?
Well, it would look very much as it did when I was a little girl, because the progress wasn't rapid like it is today. We had no paved roads. There were no streets here at all. Everything was mud roads, and the transportation, as I have mentioned, the commercial transportation was the Pennsylvania Railroad on the west side in Cecil Township, and the B&O Railroad on the east side. But even the roads weren't the same. This road didn't go past this house at that time. It came in at the crossroads and then across the side of this hill and up just beyond the bend. They evidently didn't like to build bridges, and they went down over the hill there and forded the run because the bank was low, and then went up in front of the fire company house and on up onto the hill where Mr. George lives. That's exactly across from your high school. And when they changed the road, then they had to build a new school because the road was taken away from the school. And Pleasant Valley was the school that they built. And it was built in 1893. And it was the first school that was not named for the farm that it was built on or built near. The Thompsonville School was built on the Fife farm, but it was surrounded by the Denison property, so it was called the Denison School. But this school, Pleasant Valley, got its name from the men who were building the school. They evidently didn't come from around here, and they said, oh, this is such a beautiful place. This should be called Pleasant Valley. And so that's what it was.
That's awesome.
And if it had been named for the farm it was built on, it would have been called the Weaver School because Mr. Weaver gave the property for it.
Obviously, since you've been a resident for over 80 years, you've obviously have a lot of knowledge about the community and you've witnessed a lot of changes. What do you feel is the most significant change in the community that it's experienced?
Well, that isn't very hard to answer because the most significant change is transportation. In 1909, the Pittsburgh Railways Company started a streetcar line between Washington and Pittsburgh, and that's why I went to Canonsburg to high school. It was so much more convenient for us to go to Canonsburg on the streetcar, and the fare was only 10 cents than it was to go to Peters Township High School by horse and buggy. And then in 1920, someone, I suppose the road commissioners decided maybe they should pave a road to Pittsburgh. And they started to build a brick road, and it went past here. And they started down by the creek, which is the west end of the township, but it only went up here to the bend of the road, and it was 16 feet wide, and that was the first that I know of that was paved. But the road also, as I said, since it went across here and was changed, when it got beyond the golf course, instead of going up over the hill to McMurray, it went around that hill to McMurray, and again you forded a stream at McMurray. So and it was all mud roads, or dirt roads, and people who did buy an automobile, and there were few. I remember when I would run to the window to see an automobile, and the people that did buy an automobile had to store them for the winter because they couldn't run them on the roads. The roads weren't ready. It was due to the invention and buying of cars that preceded the paving of the roads. They had to have paved roads in order to run their cars. And I think probably that has been the biggest change, because now people can go out in their cars at any time. And the first car that I saw was that had no top, no windshield, no front doors at all, and the wheels were almost like buggy wheels, and the gear shift was on the running board. And it only went about 15 miles an hour, but the ladies tied their hats on. They always had to wear a hat in those days. And then I remember the first car I rode in. And that was a big moment when I got to ride in a car.
Can you tell us about your first experience? What kind of car was it that you rode
It
in?
was an Overland,
Mm-hmm.
and Mr. Johnston had it. And they had side curtains just like you put on a buggy in the wintertime. And I can't remember where I went with them, but I think I went to a baccalaureate sermon for Peters Township High School. I think that's where I went. And then after that, we didn't get a car till about 1927, and it was a marathon. Those bakes you never hear of anymore. And it had a sound that I could tell, even when I was in the house, I could tell when our car was coming home.
Well, you were speaking before about how bad the roads were and poor conditions for driving and such. How did that have an effect if someone was ill or sick? How would you know?
Well, that was a very trying time. As I said, there were no telephones, not until 1903. And I can give you a little story about how trying that was. A farmer, and with his hired hand, had decided to take a load of hay to Pittsburgh one afternoon. And his little girl was sick, and but they didn't think she was very ill. But and her mother and aunt were there and to take care of her. But as the day grew on, she became very much worse, and the mother had to keep going to the door to see if she could see someone who was passing to go for a doctor. And finally, she saw a cousin. He was horseback, and she asked him to go and find the doctor. And you see, the doctor didn't have a telephone. There were no telephones. And then she said, when you find the doctor and tell him to come, then go down to Hill Station, which was about 4 miles. And there was a man who lived down there that went to Pittsburgh every day, and tell him to go down to the wharf where they sold hay and tell the farmer to come home, that his child was very sick. Well, they couldn't get the word to him then until the next morning. And then the hired hand was to bring the team home. And the doctor came and he said, I don't think the child will live through the night, but I'll come back by midnight. And he came back at midnight. He told afterwards he came back to sign the child's death certificate, but she lived and grew up. But you see how hard it was to get help. You just had to go around. When this cousin didn't go to the doctor's office, he just rode around to see where he could find the doctor. And the doctor in the wintertime rode horseback, and in the, mostly, and if the roads were so they could run a sleigh, why, he came by a sleigh, and he had a shovel in the sleigh, so if he had to shovel his way out, he could. And he charged $1.75 a house call.
I guess that all changed though when the telephones were installed.
What?
I guess that all changed when the telephones were installed.
Oh yes, it changed a great deal. I recall when the first telephone line came through, and of course we got it. And the man that put it in and my father were both working at it, or there. And I was curious, and I was looking on, and they said, wouldn't you like to talk to Clarissa? Clarissa Weaver lived up over the hill. And they set me up and rang her ring. It went, you cranked the thing, you know. And I'm sure she could have heard me without the telephone, because I yelled. I thought you had to make yourself heard. But and then when you wanted to call somebody that wasn't on your party line, you just rang Central, which is one ring, and asked for the person you wanted by name. And
everyone knew everyone?
Well, everybody knew everybody else, or who they were within a 5-mile radius, and now we don't know people across the street. But then they changed it to, you had numbers, and our number was 107. And they called by number, and then after that they called by line and number, and then mine is a private line.
Right.
When I started to do counseling, I got a private line.
Well, obviously, you're part of Peters Township history, and in fact, your family was a part of American history. Is it true that your grandfather or your great-great-grandfather did some work for George Washington?
Well, that's true. My great-great-great-grandfather was the Indian interpreter for George Washington. But that was not on my Baird side of the house. That was on my mother's side of the house. And he had been captured by the Indians when he was 15 years old. And he had made his way from South Carolina to York, PA, when he was 12. And then he hired out to a farmer and stayed there till he was 15, and he made his way across the mountains to Pittsburgh, and then hired out as a clerk to traders who were setting up posts in Ohio. And he went into Ohio, and he was at the trading post by himself when the Delaware Indians came along and took him. And he was told that if he didn't obey them and do what they wanted him to do and become one of them, why, his alternative was to be killed. Well, when you have an alternative like that, you go along. But then he had lived at one time on at Sandusky, and he had a trading post by that time, and he would come to Pittsburgh to get supplies. And George Washington had come up because he owned a lot of Washington County, and people were building on his property without buying it. And he came up to find out about it, and he met with my great-great-great-grandfather. But on the other side of the house, my great-great-grandparents were among the earliest natives of Washington County. And I have the certificate and all the credentials to prove it. They were on the tax list in 1781 when the township was organized.
So Bairds have lived here ever since?
And yes, and many of them still live in the area. Mm-hmm. And I know their roots go back to Center Church when it was started. Center Church was founded in 1828, and their names was on that earliest list of membership there.
Now, if you were talking about the Indians in the area, and that's something really new to people today. We, don't know much about them. Can you tell us what sort of relationship they had with the people who lived here? Do you remember hearing stories about where they...
I think, no, I don't know anything about the Indians. That was before my time, a long time before my time. But I remember that but my own grandfather, he lived in Ohio, and he played with Indian children. They were still there. He was born in 1832, 1832, and my grandfather Baird was born in 1822, and this other one was born in 1832. And the one that was born in 1832, there were Indians living all around him at that time, because the Indians didn't go west from Ohio until 1843. And so he had Indian friends that he played with. And in the field next to where my great-grandmother lived an Indian family. And evidently they were becoming Christianized, because they had a little girl that they called Little Wildflower, and she took sick and died. And the Indian mother came over and asked my great-grandmother if she would say a prayer at the grave of the little girl. So evidently they were becoming Christianized, and grandmother did it. And because the Indian mother was so pleased, she made for her a beautiful purse. She took 2 pieces of tan fringed leather and put them together, but before she put them together, she beaded each side in a scroll design of seed pearls in white and shades of green. And my cousin still has that purse.
Oh, that sounds beautiful.
But then in 1843, the government was sending the people west, and my mother used to be able to sing a song about the Indians leaving, and one of the verses was Sandusky, Tamokti, and Broken Sword Stream, no more will I see you except in my dream. That's what the Indians were thinking.
But what made you decide to become a teacher in Peters Township?
I didn't decide. I was that way all my life. When I was a little girl, I didn't even want Saturday to come. I wanted to be in school. And it wasn't that I was a genius or anything, far from it. But I loved school. And this would be hard for you to believe, but when I was 7 years old, I knew all the states of the United States, the capital of each one, and what each one was noted for, all the counties of Pennsylvania, and all the townships of Washington County, when I was 7 years old. And the reason for that was that we had an exceptionally fine teacher, and he drilled us on that. But we drilled ourselves. When our parents found out that that was what he was planning to do, they got maps and put on the wall for us. And we would try every evening, we would go to that map and say them over and see who would be first one to miss. so we became quite proficient in it. But I had always wanted to be a teacher, and I have never regretted it.
And you were a teacher for 35 years?
I taught for 35 years, and at the end of 35 years, I quit to take care of my mother. Then I was out for 2 years, and Mr. Day came and asked me, as I mentioned, if I would go back, because after I got my master's degree, I started on my counselor's certification. I've told people I am a perennial co-ed. I just keep going on. And so when he asked me that, I said I can't, because teachers who have taken their pension aren't permitted to teach except 50 days a year. And that would work down to 3 half days a week, and you can't do very much in 3 half days a week. And Mr. Day said, well, if we give you an assistant, would you think of doing it? So I talked it over with my mother, and she thought I should do it. She had been a teacher too, and it was sort of in the blood. And so I decided to do it, and they gave me Mr. Diebold, and he was just an exceptionally fine assistant. And he helped for 2 years, and then they got a full-time teacher, and I stayed on for 2 more, and then because by that time Mother was getting increasingly worse, and I was working around the clock. Mm-hmm. And then I was out for 2 years and didn't do anything, although I started on genealogical research. I can't sit with idle hands. And I had a quilt top that had been made before 1885 by an aunt of mine. And we knew it had been made before that time because that was the year she died. And I had the top, and I thought, well, this would be a good time to make it into a quilt. And another aunt said to me, well, she said, I have my quilting frames up for 3 weeks at a time. I said, 3 weeks? It'll take me 3 years. And it took me 6, but I got it done. And I'm kind of proud of it. But then Mr. O'Connell from Canonsburg called me one morning, and he had wanted me to go there and teach regularly. And I said, no, I wouldn't do that. But one morning he called me, and he said, we have 11 teachers out. He said, we're in dire need of teachers. Will you come as a substitute? And I did. And I did that for 9 years. Then I quit again. And I haven't been back in the schoolroom since.
Do you ever miss teaching?
Pardon?
Do you ever miss teaching, miss the students?
Well, I did at first, but I wouldn't have let my mother know that for anything, because I didn't want her to feel bad that I was quitting on her account. And I loved every minute of teaching. I've always liked it. And but now I'm still interested in the schools. That's why you're here today. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. Because if I weren't interested, I'd have just said, oh no, we won't bother.
When you first began teaching, you taught in the one-room schools, the one-room school that's right over here, that's still standing in the township. And I know one of the first schools was Thompsonville School. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
About teaching in the first?
Teaching in the first school and the first schoolhouse that was built in the community.
Well, the first schoolhouse that was built in, I don't know exactly when the first schoolhouse was built in the community. I know that the Craighead School was a very, very old school, and that was the forerunner of Pleasant Valley. And Pleasant Valley itself was built, the one down here, was built in 1893. And this house was built about the same time. So that's how old this house is. And Denison School, my grandfather went to that school, and he was going there in, well, he was born in 1822, and I don't know whether they was, the first school books, you know, were the Bay Psalm book, the Bible, and the New England Primer, because way back in that day, they didn't have bookstores, and every family had those books. So they could take those books to school and they'd all have the same books. And in the very early school, they didn't have desks and seats like they have today. They had benches, and the children kept their books on the windowsill. But down at this Pleasant Valley School, they had large seats in the rear of the room, and in the front of the room they had them for the little tots, because all ages of children went. And in Pleasant Valley, they were double seats. You had a seatmate. And strangely enough, there wasn't trouble with too much talking among the children. But the boys sat on one side of the room, and the girls sat on the other. So when you called a class, there were boys and girls both in the class, so they had to go to the front of the room to recite. And there was a long bench under the blackboard, and usually they would sit on the long bench, except in spelling class. And in spelling class, they would trap in spelling. Trapping is, they had a spelling lesson of probably 20 words or maybe 25, and the child at the head of the class was given a ticket for that day if she weren't trapped. If she missed a word, the child who spelled it correctly below her went to the top of the class. Then at the end of the day, the one at the top of the class got his ticket and went to the foot of the class and then worked his way up again. And there was never any trouble about doing homework and spelling, because after you got 5 tickets, you got a little card. And after you got 5 cards, you got a larger card. And so everybody was wanting to get these cards. And I have a big card or two, so one big card indicated that I had been to the top of the class 25 times.
Oh, wow. Can you tell us about your first day of teaching and your first teaching job that you had?
My first year of teaching was the acid test. It was coming near the beginning of the year to start school, and the school didn't have a teacher. And my first teacher was a lady, and she only taught till Christmas time because she got married at that time. And then a man teacher came who taught us about so much geography. And when I didn't have a school at the time, but I was certified to teach. And the teachers could take a test, and if they passed the test, they could teach. And she had told, without my knowledge, she told the school board to ask me to be the teacher. And when I learned where I was to go, because it was considered such a bad school, I had some nervousness over it, but I went and I stayed with her. She lived in that district, and so I stayed with her. And the children, I had heard before I went there that they were having just a little slip of a girl that was going to teach, and they'd carry her out the first week. What was our school coming to? And I don't know whether it's independence or really stubbornness, but I was determined that I wouldn't be carried out. I can even remember what I wore the first day. And I wore a white sailor dress with a blue collar, and I thought I was very dressed up. And I had, I may tell you this, that a little girl, she'd been 7 the year before, and she had a difference with the man teacher that was there at that time, and she used the iron poker on him. And so she was 8 years old when I started, and I said to her, I gave her the third grade reader, for she was 8 years old, and she said, I guess I read in the fourth reader. And I said, well, if you read nicely in the third reader, I'll be glad to give you a fourth reader. But when I called the class to go to the front of the room, she didn't go. And I said, Bessie, this is your class. And she looked over her shoulder and she said, I guess I ain't going up there. Well, she went. And strangely enough, about a year ago, I got a telephone call, and she said, do you remember me? And she gave me her name. And I thought, well, how could I forget you? But I told her I remembered her. And I said, where are you living? She said, in Washington. And she wanted some direction, and I gave them to her. And I said, you'll have to go past my place to go to this place that she wanted to go. She wanted to go to the cemetery. And I said, I wish you would stop. But about 2 months later, her obituary was in the paper. But after 60 years, she had called me on the phone.
Well, did you find that when you were a teacher that most of your students went on to college, or did they go to farm work?
No, that was not true. When I was a little girl going down here to Pleasant Valley, the big boys and girls, you see, this was all farming community. And the boys especially were needed on the farm in the fall and the spring. So the big boys would help on the farm until maybe the 1st of November. Then they would come into school. And then about the middle of March, they would quit again and help with the spring work. The girls were better about coming because the work for them wasn't as stringent as for the boys. But even when I went to high school, there were not too many people going to high school at that time. But the first class in Peters Township had 2 graduates. The first year it was in session, it had 2 graduates, because the 2 girls that were graduating had come from another high school and finished at Peters, and they both went to college. That was very unusual. And when I was in high school, we had a very fine class. We had 3 doctors in our class and 2 ministers, and we were quite up and going and very progressive. But the girls usually would start out with the teacher's examination. They would go to summer school, taking a teacher's course at summer school, and then pass the examination. And then if you taught through the first year, you could take a provisional examination, and that would allow you to teach for 3 years without taking another examination. And at the end of that time, you could take a professional examination, and that gave you a certificate for all time. And I know teachers that are living today that taught on those certificates all their lives. But I didn't. I wanted to teach in high school, and I went on to college. But I didn't do it right away.
When you first got your certificate and you first started teaching, were men usually chosen as teachers over women, or did men usually get paid more than women for teaching?
Yes. Earlier, way back, the men got $15 and found. Found was boarding around. They boarded around with their with the parents of their children. If they didn't board around, they got 18. And the lady teachers got 12 if they didn't board around, but they got 9 if they did board around. And you know, there was something still in the minds of directors when I taught at Peters Township High School. Before I quit the last time, I was not paid so much because I stayed at home.
Well,
And I had a master's degree, and I was the only teacher at that time that had a master's degree.
Being a teacher in a one-room school, can you tell us about some of the responsibilities that you had to your students besides being their teacher?
A teacher in a one-room school was everything. She was the playground director, she was the referee, she was the doctor, she was the nurse, she was the janitress. Every night after school hours were from 9 till 4. At one time in the very early days, it was from 8:30 till 4. But when I started to teach, it was from 9 till 4 o'clock. And when I was teaching here at Pleasant Valley, the children, I have a souvenir I gave the children on the last day of school. It's there on the table. And I had 42 children in all grades. And besides hearing 30 classes a day, you can hardly understand that, but you had to have 30 classes a day because everyone had to be heard in all of the subjects. Then when it came spring, because the 8th grade had to take the counties, that was the county examinations, then they had been only having 15 minutes a day for grammar and arithmetic, which were the 2 most difficult subjects. And so the teacher on her own would stay till 5 o'clock if they wanted to stay, and they always wanted to stay. You didn't have to, they weren't compelled to stay, but they always stayed. And then in the last 4 weeks, I taught on Saturday morning, and we didn't get anything extra for that. We just did it because we wanted to help the children get through. And when they took the county examination, they didn't take it in their home school given by their own teacher. A certain Saturday was set aside by the county superintendent, and he sent the questions to the teachers that he had designated from the township who were to give the test. And they gave the test, but they did not correct the papers. They collected the papers and sent them to the county superintendent. And if the child passed the examination, why, the county superintendent issued them a diploma. And if they didn't pass the test, he wrote them a letter and advised them to return to 8th grade for another year.
Can you tell us the sort of discipline that was prevalent in the school that you taught at when you first began teaching? What sort of standards were you?
I can very well say that we had some strenuous moments. 1 or 2 of them were rather difficult, but we ironed them out very well. And I think if I ever had any success in teaching, and I hope I have had, it was because I treated the children like I wanted to be treated myself. When I was teaching at Pleasant Valley, one of the boys came in one day and he said, "Bill won't give us the bat." And I said, "Whose bat is it?" He said, "It's mine." "Oh," I said, "I think he'll give it to you." I said, "We'll see." And I walked out onto the porch, and this was a black boy, and he was about 14. He could have tied me in a bow knot. But there was a little first grader on the porch. And I said to her, Evelyn, would you want to take a walk with me? And so I took her by the hand, and we went down across the playground where this boy had his one leg swung up over the end of the bat, and he was just watching me. And I was thinking, she was prattling along, and I was trying to answer her, but I was thinking, oh, what am I going to say to him? What am I going to say to him? But I got within as close as, almost as that chair, and I said, William, I'm sort of embarrassed to have to speak to the biggest boy in the class. He just turned the bat right over. I didn't have any need to worry at all.
Well, since you've lived in the community so long, you must have seen it change a lot. What do you think are some of the biggest changes that you've seen? Just even looking out your window, what have been some changes that over the years?
Oh, the biggest changes in Peters Township has been the arrival of new people, of people who come in here from business firms, and they're here for a couple of years and they're transferred someplace else. We never get to know them. As I said, I remember this field over here when it was a grazing field. It was a grazing field clear to the crossroads. And now they have all these people, and the traffic is terrific. I waited down at the mailbox one day 5 full minutes before I could cross the road, because I have to cross the road to get my mail. And I think that is probably one of the biggest things, and it's still growing. But if you will notice, this is a modern map of Peters Township here on the piano. And the western part of the Peters Township is so much more built up than the eastern part. But the eastern part will get that way, you may be sure. I was with one of your former teachers one day. We'd gone to lunch, and so we drove around over the township, and I was amazed. There are hardly any farms left. And at one time, all of this was farming community. Mr. Weaver had a farm. Mr. McDowell still has his farm, but he kept sheep. And he kept sheep in the last, I think he said he got them in about 1929. And that was a fine way of keeping his farm clean, because sheep eat the grass closely. And Washington County at one time was the greatest sheep-raising county in the United States. And it ceased to be that when the mines opened and the people came in to operate the mines. They brought their dogs with them, and the dogs run the sheep. And if sheep are run by dogs, they don't grow right afterward. It isn't that they're frightened. I know Mr. McDowell came over one day and asked me if I'd seen a dog. And I said, is it yours? He said, it better not be. And the dog had been on his sheep. And then another thing that has happened in discipline, really, he has had all sorts of inconvenience by people riding their motorcycles over his fences. They rode the old fences down, and he put up new fences, and they cut them. And one day he went out, and there was a sheep lying in the field, and he just turned it over with his foot, and there was an arrow through its back. So you can understand why people are getting away from farming. They just can't do it anymore. Mr. Bebout, down toward Venetia, he still has his farm. But on this side of McMurray, I don't know where there are any farms.
What do you feel is the most historical part of Peters Township today?
The most historical part? Well, that would be hard to answer. I think the churches and the schools and the roads were the beat about them, and coming of the automobile and the telephone and paved roads. You can't go on a road that isn't paved today but you can drive on it. And when you think that that has all happened within the last 60 years, because I know when we had the marathon car in 1927, why, you couldn't run it in the wintertime because the roads weren't fit to run it on. And people walked a lot. I do want to tell you that Peters Township had a higher form of education, an institution of higher form of education, when they didn't have a high school. They had the old Stonewall Academy, and it was over, if you know where Center Church is, it was not very far from Center Church, probably as far from Center Church as down to the Shop and Save store from here. And they used the Center Church for their assembly and for their literary societies. And there are very few people know about that old academy. And when I was small and we walked over the hills to church on Sunday, I had noticed this stone wall and the Lombardy poplar trees. And I said to my father, what was there? It must have been something important. Oh, he said, that was the site of the old Stonewall Academy, but I don't know when it was discontinued. I don't know whether my aunts had gone to that school. I know my father didn't. He went to Jefferson College in Canonsburg, and then he went to Ohio Northern University in Ohio. That's where he met my mother, and that's how I happened to be here.
Well, since you and your whole family have lived in Peters Township for so many years, what do you think is an aspect of the community that has kept you and your family here?
That is what?
That has kept you here, made you want to continue to live here in this community?
I think we have noticed that people coming out here want to stay. New people. They seem to want to stay here. And of course, we have our roots here. They're down so deep it would be difficult to pull them up. But it has been a pleasant community, and we had schools and the churches, but as I said, there were only two churches, the two Presbyterian churches. I had thought until a short while ago that the Methodist Church in Venetia was in Peters Township, but in reading Mr. Noah Thompson's history, it was in Union Township across the road from Peters Township. And now, if you were to check the number of churches in Peters Township, there must be more than a half a dozen. It was safe to say that it would be more than a half a dozen. So it had its advantages, and of course we had the streetcar line. The streetcar line gave way to the bus service to Pittsburgh, and we had that. We have had excellent transportation just by streetcar and bus, not counting the railroad earlier, since February 1909, and the bus was discontinued last October, and I am isolated.
You've obviously picked out some things here that you want to show us. Can you tell us a little bit about the things that you have on the table there?
Well, I had put those things out because it was the old map of Peters Township with all of the people who lived there at that time. Their names are on that map. And the churches are marked and the schools are marked. And I thought that would be interesting. And so then I put the modern map up so that you could see the difference. In the modern map, the western part of the township is the one that is most closely settled. And in the old map, it was really through the central part of the township. And then this is a patent. And a patent was used instead of giving a deed. If you sell property, you have to give a written contract that you have sold the property. And this was the way that they did that in the very early times. This patent is dated 1786, so it's over 202 years old. And it was, it has a state seal on, and it was granted by the first governor of Pennsylvania to an Anthony Height. And it was my great-great-grandparents that bought it from Mr. Height, and so they got it. And in that early day, I want to tell you also, there were no cemeteries, and my great-great-grandparents were buried in the orchard on the farm. And they were, their bodies are still there. When we sold the farm, we had the problem of wanting to know what would we do with those graves. Something had to be done with them. And we sold the farm in 1953. And I was the only one who was available to do the business concerned with it. And I went to the mortuary and asked the mortician what we should do with it. And he said, don't try to lift the graves. He said, when he found out the date, the latest date was 1824, and this was 1953. He said, you'd lift it, and as soon as it struck the air, there wouldn't be anything there. Well, I went to the stone man, and he said, I would suggest you do the same thing that they do when boys are lost at sea, or anyone is lost at sea, or boys don't return from the service. They're missing in action. He said they put a tombstone in the cemetery for them. So we did that. There is a tombstone on the Baird lot in Center Cemetery, and it says, in memory of the grandparents of Thomas Baird, James Anderson, who died 1824, his wife died 1809, or I believe those are the other way around. Then below it, inscribed on the stone, is who are interred on the family farm in Peters Township. So it's left there. A few years ago, the Boy Scouts had a project, and one of the boys his mother called me and said that her son was given the project of looking up these graves, and she knew about these graves over on Bird Homestead Farm. And she said, would you take him to them? And I said, yes, I'd be glad to, but I said, how does he get over here? She said, oh, he'll come over on his bike. So he came over on his bike, and we drove over then to where the graves were. And at the time the graves were put there, there was a huge boulder laid on the grave, and then there were 5 juniper trees. It was against the fence, and the 5 juniper trees made a half circle there. And one of the juniper trees was still in existence. And Mr. Emerson was living on the lot when we went there, and I went down to the house and explained to him who we were and what we were doing. And he said, oh, I was told there were graves by my house. And I said, they won't hurt you. But we didn't want to leave the, put a little fence around it because we thought that people would just throw junk in there. So that was the way we resolved this situation.
Well, Ms. Baird, before closing the interview, is there anything that you'd like to say to the community about yourself, or you'd like to share with the community?
Well, I have always been very pleased that I'm a part of this community. And of course, I have lived here all my life. I was born in Peters Township. I wasn't born in this house, but I was born in Peters Township. And my father was born in Peters Township. And his father, I'm not sure that his father was, but he lived in Peters Township. His father had died when he was 15, and he came to live with the Andersons, who were his grandparents. But he went to the Denison School, and that was his copybook. And that copybook is 152 years old. And then the Center Church, there's a picture there of Center Church, how it was before it was built to. And it was not always on that particular spot. It was down farther where the manse is. The first church was down there. And then they built the one that is there now, but it was just a single room, no basement under it, and how we worked to put a basement under that church. And then the last few years, and it wouldn't be the last few years to you, it would be probably before your time even, the additions were made. Mm-hmm. And the school, the wing of education was put on, and the cemetery, Mr. Bell, or the Bells, gave the land for the church and the cemetery, and the cemetery was there to be used by the members of the church. And there are people buried in that cemetery who never set a foot in any church. But they were free then, but they are selling them now. But there are very old stones there. There is a stone there that the death was in 1811, and the church wasn't founded until 1828. But evidently that was due to a grave being relocated. And it's filling up fast now.
Okay, Mrs. Baird, thank you very much for talking to us today. We want to thank you, and also for talking to all the people in Peters Township, because by letting us interview you and telling us your valuable knowledge and sharing with us what you know, you've really helped a lot of people in Peters Township, and thank you very much.
Well, I'm pleased that you came.
Unforgettable, that's what you are. Unforgettable, though near or far, like a song of love that clings to me.